Well, while the media freaks out about the diplomacy with Russia, our next guest, American academic Gilbert Doctorow, says that having respect for Putin and diplomacy with Russia makes you a great American patriot because you then recognize the power of peace, diplomacy, instead of constant provocation. He's been warning for years about the neocons led by John McCain trying to get a war with Russia. He warned about the Obama administration's provocation with Russia, particularly around the way we covered the Olympics. Now he says the Trump administration is doing the right thing, but may use this advantage to drive a wedge between Russia and China. So we're not done here. Gilbert Doctorow, thank you so much for joining us and coming back to Redacted.
Well, my pleasure to be with you.
So you live in Europe, so it's late for you. We really appreciate your time. Do you think this diplomacy with Russia is what we've needed all along? And can you explain why you've been warning about this for over a decade?
We're going back to 2015 when I first wrote a book, Does Russia Have a Future? By meant as a great power. And I followed that up a couple of years later, Does America Have a Future? And the reason that these titles were given, and they are linked, is that since about 2010, 2012, the United States has been determined to remove Russia as a major power and as a global competitor, and it has staked its own fortune on that very policy, so that the success or failure in the attack on Russia has had direct implications for America's success as a great power. And we see that today. These things have come together. Every attempt by the American administration, successive administrations, from Obama on, to handicap Russia, to weaken Russia, have come back and harmed the American position in the world. It has finally taken Donald Trump to have the courage to face these facts and this reality and to begin to normalize relations with Russia in the hope of extracting some kind of global advantage. And I think the global advantage will come in realpolitik, or realistic politics tradition, going back to the conclusion of World War II and what was the Yalta Agreement between three great powers, the meetings of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. This is in the cards, and you'll notice that there were three baskets of things to do that came out of the Riyadh meetings a day ago, and the three baskets were first to restore something approaching normalcy in diplomatic relations, because you cannot proceed to work on the Ukraine war situation, to work on all of the open issues where the United States and Russia can have common interests in a constructive way, if you don't have the manpower, the experts in place, the communications in place. And they were almost severed completely by the Biden administration. So we don't even have ambassadors in place in Moscow or Washington. So that is one basket, to restore normal diplomatic communications for problem solving. The second is a variety of individual identified areas of common interest where there can be constructive U.S.-Russian relations, and including that, resolving the Ukraine war. And then the third basket is precisely what you were suggesting, geopolitics. It was named precisely by the three Americans delegation who gave their press conference following the meeting with the Russians in Riyadh. It was called the geopolitical questions. And that primarily is the relations that Russia has with China, with Iran, with North Korea. And but you'll notice, because there are three baskets, addressing that question of geopolitics and the American wish list to drive a wedge does not prevent progress on the first 2 points. The first basket is to be addressed immediately. That's clear. They can't go anywhere without having proper diplomatic services in place. I don't mean consulates. That's very nice. But the embassies themselves are undermanned. And the Russian embassy in Washington is so hamstrung by various limitations, including the fact that their bank accounts aren't operational. They have been cut off from SWIFT. They can't even pay their bills. The Russian embassy in Washington. That is the first thing that will clearly be resolved in the next week or two. Then they move on
Gilbert,
to these issues.
So I was going to ask you, Gilbert, on the European side. So you're hearing a lot of hand-wringing on the European side over the past 24 hours that they're not really being brought to the table. They seem really upset about this. Ursula von der Leyen wanting to push additional sanctions now on Russia, while at the same time, Marco Rubio and the Secretary of State for the United States is wanting to pull back on sanctions against Russia. What do you make of this détente?
Well, if after this succession of amazing developments, starting with President Trump's 90-minute telephone call with Vladimir Putin, there about which we heard very little as content. But the next day we heard a lot about content, or later that day, when Pete Hegseth made his debut here in Brussels, speaking to the Ukraine support group or coordinating group, and he delivered the double whammy that Ukraine is not going to restore its pre-war boundaries, and that Ukraine is not going to enter NATO. So that was the first real shock treatment. Then more came towards the weekend. Of course, there was J.D. Vance's speech in the Munich conference, which was set up to underline the division between Europe and the United States, and I'd say to bring out this division in a way that that the whole world can understand. That one is the peace camp and the other is a war camp. This was done by Vance's discussing why Europe is not democratic, why Europe is its own worst enemy and is defeating its security by this authoritarian Soviet-style censorship, deprivation of freedom of speech, and exclusion of large parts of the population, the populist parties on the right, the populist parties on the left, from equal participation in political life in their countries. That really shook up the leaders, political leaders, military leaders of Europe at the conference, and people who covered it in the newspapers here. I think now of the Le Monde, which had Sylvia Kaufman, who's a well-known personality in British news and in the New York Times op-ed pages, a long-time Le Monde New York bureau chief. She was writing yesterday in Le Monde how the speech by J.D. Vance was fascist and hostile. So you've got the division here, almost irreparable division, has come up, and that served the purposes of Trump. And he went and made the rift still wider, knowing full well what he was doing. When the State Department sent out a questionnaire to all the Europeans saying, well, you're very unhappy that you're not yet participating in the talks. And this was, of course, the big conversation point through all of Europe in this weekend. Shock that the American talks with the Russians did not include either Kiev or, more importantly, themselves. They were not uninvited to this. And all of them know English well enough and American political law well enough to understand the concept that if you don't have a seat at the table, it means you're on the menu. So they understood that they were on the menu.
That's right.
And then this rift was driven by the questionnaire, as I said, a questionnaire which had the intent of saying, look, gentlemen, put up or shut up. You say you want to have a role here. So what are you going to do? What are you going to put up for to enforce a peace agreement that we all will reach and to provide security for Ukraine, which you say is your objective? Of course, here was a great opportunity. Mr. Macron does not let any crisis go without his participating in a solution. And so he rallied Europeans, the key countries, to Paris for a meeting on Monday. And these were key countries involved in support of Ukraine. Of course, there was France, Germany, UK, Spain was there, Italy was there, and a few other odds and ends. But of course, the NATO was represented by Secretary General Rutte, the governing, the highest executive of the European institutions, the European Council was represented by Da Costa, its president. And of course, von der Leyen. Escape, you cannot avoid von der Leyen. She had to show up. Well, after 4 hours of deliberations, it was a failure. They couldn't agree on anything. And I think it was intentional.
I want to ask you about that, actually, because they have to reposition themselves after trailing behind Joe Biden for 4 years. And so the United States, we know Trump is telling the truth that Ukraine started the war first, but really it's our own government. It's the CIA that prompted Ukraine to start attacking those people. So the bad guy behind the bad guy is our own government, the United States intelligence. The Europeans have pretended not to know that and have just promoted this propaganda of Putin's unprovoked aggression. It is the modern day equivalent of weapons of mass destruction. Can European leaders save face now because they're so far up the backside of the old Biden narrative? Forgive me for asking it that way.
Let's be more discriminating here, where you've got the Brits and you've got the continental Europeans. The most aggressive people, far more aggressive than the United States, from the get-go, have been the British. And let's be specific about this. So many events around the development of the Ukraine war, and in particular as regards the terrorist activities by Ukraine, the various attacks in Russia, scandals that were meant to do harm to the credibility of Mr. Putin, and like the death of Navalny. These are all orchestrated by whom? By the CIA? No, by MI6. Now, we all go back to 2003 and the Iraq War, and it was commonplace to say the special relationship between Britain and the United States meant that Tony Blair was the lapdog of the American President Bush. What's happened since is that lapdog has become the attack dog. The MI6 and the Brits have been out in front. They have been the most aggressive, the most destructive in the war in Ukraine. Who was it, after all, who persuaded Zelensky not to go to sign the already initialed peace agreement with Russia on April 15th, more or less, 2022? It was the visit of Boris Johnson. Now, it's easy to say that he did the bidding of Washington, but I think that is a simplification. The Brits had their own agency, and it was to lead the Americans into this disaster because they knew better. Who had the contacts with Ukrainian agents that enabled the murder of Navalny? It was the MI6. It wasn't the CIA. So who could have been involved in the scandalous Bucha massacre that was used to persuade Europeans to sign on to the American sanctions from hell that Victoria Nuland and her team had prepared? It was the Brits. So let's divide this a bit. Mr. Macron, he speaks out of both sides of his mouth. And he will go this way or that way where he sees the opportunities. But the Brits are stuck. And if I were Mr. Starmer, I would think twice about this trip in the coming week to Washington. because
Right.
now that Zelensky has been denounced by the president as a dictator, I don't know what he thinks he can achieve by visiting the Oval Office.
Going to the Oval Office to campaign on behalf of a dictator who's canceled elections and murdered political opponents and American journalists. Like, I don't think the White House is going to be very forgiving for that, reading the temperature of the room in the United States. Americans are sick of it. I see people right now in our chat room, they're sick of it. They're sick of us propping up this propaganda in Ukraine. Gilbert, we'll get you out of here on this. I know it's 10:30 there in Brussels where you are right now, so we'll let you get back to your evening. Final question here. NATO. Big rumors floating around right now not a rumor, in the German newspaper Bild just published saying, and similar to the Financial Times, that the United States is ready to leave NATO and get out of NATO altogether. What do you make of that, and what would that mean for the future of NATO?
Let's use a little bit of Sovietology here and parse the words of Mr. Trump. Just notice what he said in the last day. We will not take all of our troops out of Europe. We will not take all of our. That means it's a lot more than the 20,000 with troops taken out that we heard about 10 days ago. Even the Brits acknowledge, even Starmer acknowledges that they can do nothing in Ukraine without American presence, without the Americans providing the logistics, the satellite intelligence and the rest of it. So as the United States cuts its forces in Europe, Europe is defenseless. And being defenseless, they will have to acknowledge that they are alone against the big Russian neighbor, and they damn well better do something to accommodate themselves to the Russian neighbor, and instead of sending in new sanctions, which cannot be enforced without American backing. That is a situation. I cannot see that the present leadership in the European institutions can stay in place. I say Mr. Macron can talk out of both sides of his mouth. I don't think that Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas have that luxury. I think they're going to be on the street.
On the street.
Wow. All right. That's a prediction. And I had forgotten the case that you made for the British actually killing Alexei Navalny. I refer you to the piece we did with Mr. Doctorow recently. Please look that up on Redacted and subscribe to his newsletter because it has a lot of bombshells. This guy, he's a great researcher.
Yeah, our chat room is just saying, wow, what an incredible guest. So thank you, Gilbert. Thank you for staying up late for us there in Belgium. You are in a nest of vipers there in the middle of Brussels. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gilbert. Great to see you. And have a great night.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.